Then you can pause it.
Yeah.
So if you want to pause it to,
Hello, everybody in Ireland. We've hopefully got this now where you can listen to it. So Helen and I are down in Tasmania, visiting two fellowships we have there, one in Hobart and one in Launceston. That's where we are now. And having a pretty exciting time through Victoria and Tassie. And as you most probably all aware, with the new fellowship in Bristol, there are quite a lot of people from this other group called the GRC, which I won't stop and explain anything right now. A lot of people, not only from Bristol and from Vancouver in Canada, but quite a lot of people in Geelong, in Victoria, and in these two, particularly in Launceston and Tassie, have come to the fellowship here, almost double the numbers here, small assembly. It's all very exciting. And we're actually staying with a couple that have come over, Greg and Anne Pico. So anyhow, let's get on with the talk, and really love the thought of being able to communicate with you there. And I better have a look at my watch. I'm supposed to only go for 15 minutes. We'll see if we can do the miracle, keeping it near that. So I'm going to talk about faith. So many wonderful things you can talk about from the Bible, maybe particularly the importance of faith. And first of all, is a great promise, of course, in the fruits of the Spirit, where it says in Galatians, I'll just quote the verses, and if you can write them down and look them up later, see how you go. I'm going to Galatians chapter 5 on the fruits of the Spirit, and verse 22. For the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith is number 7, meekness, temperance. Against such there is no law. The other thing we do know about the gifts of the Spirit, that also has faith as one of the gifts. So out of the 7 fruits and the 7 gifts, faith is the only one that is mentioned twice, which would maybe give you an indication that faith is important. So in Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4, it says, behold, his soul which is lifted up is not upright in him. Sorry about this. It says, but the just shall live by faith. And then this is repeated. I'm sorry about this. I'm going to have to stop. Sorry about that. I'll try again. Got a glass of water now. So in Habakkuk, it says, the just shall live by faith. Now, I don't know if there's any other passage from the Old Testament that is repeated 3 times in the New Testament, but this one is by the same author, the Apostle Paul, but in 3 different books. And I'll just read them out. Romans chapter 1, verse 17 says, for therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. Then in Galatians chapter 3, verse 11, but that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God, it is evident, for the just shall live by faith. Then again in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 38, now the just shall live by faith, but if any man draw back, my soul shall have no pleasure in him. So there you are. Must have meant a lot to Paul, because he quoted it 3 times. Many of us, when we first hear the gospel, have pretty well zero faith. We're sort of told that, God can do this and that, and we think, really? I know when I had the nominal belief in the Anglican Church, I believed that God did do things back in Bible days, and that one day he would do things in heaven. But the thought that he would do something right now was sort of, no, it just wasn't on the radar. So then we come to the Lord, and we start to be challenged with faith and belief and trust and confidence in God. And that sort of tends to grow. Now, in Hebrews chapter 11, the great faith chapter, we have Abraham. We might associate wisdom to Solomon, patience to Job. Well, we particularly associate Abraham with faith. As it's only one again twice in the same chapter on two different occasions. It records Abraham having great faith. First of all, in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8, by faith, Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out not knowing whither he went. And I dare say when you think about it, it would be pretty scary, wouldn't it? You're going into a country, you don't know what sort of reception you're going to get. You're not going with armed guard or anything. It's just you and your wife, and maybe a little bit of a lot came with him. We know that, and a few other servants and some flocks of sheep and so on. So he said, went out by faith. The Lord told me to do it. I'm going to believe that he's with me. Then later on in the same chapter of chapter 11, we see there on a totally different situation, Abraham again had to exercise his faith. And verse 17 to verse 19, by faith Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he that had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said that in Isaac shall thy seed be called, accounting that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from whence also he received him in a figure. So we're just trying to see what's going through his head at that time. But hang on a second, the promise is that my son is going to be the father of a multitude of people. And if I kill him, well, that'll never happen. You will sort of go through that process. You maybe would even start to argue with God, but he didn't. So he said, if God says it, and we now know that he, in his heart, and he's according to his faith, he believed that if he slew his son, that God would miraculously have to raise his son up again because the promise couldn't be broken. And he even went to the point of lifting the knife. And then at the last minute, the angel said, stop, you don't have to do this. I now know you'll do anything in my name. So I wanted to just read a couple of examples of faith from the Bible, great words of faith. And we know you can sometimes have just words, but particularly looking at King David as another amazing man of faith, and the well-known story of David and Goliath. But I want to just pick out of it, chapter 17, by the way, 1 Samuel chapter 17. I just want to pick out some of the words that David spoke when he came onto the battlefield, and incredible words of faith. So the first part of chapter 7, first verse, will be verse 26, when he'd listened to what the situation. And David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, what shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And again, nobody was talking like that. From the king down, and we know that King Saul was a big guy. I mean, we think that Goliath was around 9 foot, but maybe Saul was around 7 foot. Bible says he was head and shoulders above everybody around him. But nobody had confidence or faith in that. And this young lad spoke these amazing words. And later on, of course, this statement by David was recounted to King Saul. And we'll pick it up in verse 34. And David said unto Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. I think here, particularly talking about the lion. And when he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. And thy servant slew both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. It's interesting, his wording. He said this guy, this uncircumcised Philistine, has no recourse in any way to have any blessing in his life. He's not blessed of God. And the very words, he defies the people of God. So he made that clear. Verse 37, and David said, moreover, the Lord hath that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear. He will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said unto him, Go, and the Lord be with thee. Then said David to the Philistine, we're jumping down to verse 45, sorry. Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield, but I am come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into my hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So at that particular point, really, it was just words. But within minutes, of course, those words were put into action. But he started with words. And I dare say, when you think of that original statement, the just shall live by faith, maybe that's all we can do sometimes, is start with words. And it is better to talk faith and confidence, maybe even if things don't turn out, than to talk doubt and question. One thing for sure, God will never work on doubt or question, but he may and often does work by faith. And so it's always better to do that. One of the great statements there, the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into my hand. So he wasn't trusting in his own ability, even though that was amazingly good. When you think of him killing a bear and lion, he was trusting in the Lord. And we don't need to read any more of the story. We know it like the back of our hand. Now, his friend, the Saul's son, Jonathan, was also a great man of faith. It was really sad in the end that he died alongside his father in battle. And you almost feel like, oh, not Jonathan, you know. But back in chapter 14 of the same book, 1 Samuel, again, great words of faith. But on this occasion, two different men coming from two different angles, both spoke words of faith. And again, the same enemy, the Philistines. And in 1 Samuel chapter 14, verse 6, it says, And Jonathan said to the young man that bare his armor, Come, and let us go over unto the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for there is, here again is one of these great statements, for there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. And we know the story of Gideon, where the Lord whittled a 30,000 army of men down to 300, and proved the point, what Jonathan said right here. And then he said to his armor bearer, and his armor bearer said unto him, I'll get it right, verse 7, Do all that is in thine heart, turn thee, behold, I am with thee according to thy heart. Now that's amazing faith too. He's basically saying, this is not my battle, but I have such confidence in you as a man of God. If you say it's going to happen, I'm with you. And it's sometimes difficult to pick up faith as it were somebody else's faith and to go with it. So we know that these two men did achieve great things on those days and those battles. But they first of all, they spoke words of faith. Just in the New Testament, well-known story again of this man called Zacchaeus in Luke chapter 19. We'll just turn to that. And we'll just start reading because I need to keep going. Verse 1, And Jesus then entered and passed through Jericho. Behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus, which was the chief among the publicans, and he was rich. And he sought to see Jesus who he was, and could not for the press, because he was of little stature. And he ran before and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was to pass that way. So curiosity, a bit like Moses stopping and looking at the burning bush, can then lead to something. And on this occasion, when Jesus came to the place in verse 5, he looked up and saw him and said unto him, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must abide at thy house. And he made haste, and he came down, and he received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they all murmured, saying that he was gone to be the guest of a man that was a sinner. Well, of course, they didn't realize Jesus came to save sinners. So the crowd was against both of them at this point. The crowd was already always against Zacchaeus because he was sort of like a traitor and selling out his own people to the Romans. But now, of course, they're against Jesus as well, saying, well, you don't realize what you're doing here. Oh, he very much knew what he was doing. But I want to quote particularly the words of Zacchaeus. He stood and said unto the Lord in verse 8, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I've taken anything by false accusation, which was mostly a heck of a lot of money, I will restore him fourfold. Now, I haven't got a calculator here, and I wouldn't have any figures anyhow, but if I did have a calculator here, or he had one there, I reckon he ended up utterly broke when when you think of the two statements he made. And so they were great words of faith. It was called repentance, and he wanted to make restitution. And he said, right, I'm going to change my life. I've been doing these bad things. Now I'm going to do good things. And I'm going to make sure that those who've suffered at my hand, I'm going to repay them. And the Lord was just so happy. You know, when the rich young man came to Jesus and the Lord said, you know, sell all that you have and come and follow me, he just couldn't do it. And yet it was an amazing offer. Come and follow me. What an offer. And he walked away sad because his riches prevented him coming to the Lord. His trust in the arm of the flesh is what he would say. Well, Zacchaeus was the opposite. He also was a very rich man, maybe even more rich than the other man by his wickedness. But anyhow, he turned to the Lord, and of course the Lord was very impressed. This day has salvation come to this house in verse 9, for as much as he is the son of Abraham. What does that mean? Does it mean his bloodline? He certainly was a Jew. Zacchaeus is a Jewish name, and he obviously maybe wasn't a literal descendant of Abraham. Well, I think he was more a son of Abraham because he was a child of faith. So if you're a son of Abraham, you're a person of faith. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which is lost. Maybe just a couple more points. Pretty sure my time is pretty well run out. But just connecting faith with salvation. Now, that's a big one. Is faith connected to salvation? Of course it is one of the great factors. But just grabbing a couple of verses where the Lord connected it. One when he was talking to a woman in Luke 7, verse 50. I think it was the Syrophoenician woman, but whoever it was, I've only got the verse here in front of me. He said to the woman in chapter Luke 7:50, thy faith has saved thee. Go in peace. And then to a guy in Luke 18, verse 42, Jesus said unto him, receive thy sight, obviously a blind man. I've just grabbed these verses. Thy faith has saved thee. So salvation and getting to a point of victory is through faith. And then one that is definitely just about our faith of salvation is in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8. For the grace, I'll start again. For by grace are ye saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God. So faith, it's very important, it's very rewarding, it's very beneficial. And I'm just going to finish with, again, back in Hebrews chapter 11, the great chapter. Well, if we want to have any idea how important faith is, it's got a whole chapter. And, I don't know if there's any other word in the Bible that has a whole chapter, but Hebrews 11, verse 1 to the very end, is all about faith and person after person after. And in the end, he sort of runs out and, I haven't got time to talk about Gideon and Samson, throws in all these other great people. And it's an amazing list. But in verse 6, it says, now faith is the substance of things. Sorry, verse 1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Incredible statement. So faith is literally like having it. Faith is substance. Faith is evidence. And yet, in a sense, you haven't got it, but you've got it by faith. And then later on in verse 6, talking about Enoch, how he pleased God in verse 5. But in verse 6, it says, but without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. So one little point that I remember thinking of years ago, and that was medication. I'm not knocking medication, but medication works whether you believe in it or whether you don't believe in it. But God only works if you believe in him. So we need to come to him with faith, even if our faith is fairly thin on the ground, like the man who said to Jesus, I believe, but help thou my unbelief. And I think a lot of us start off that way. And maybe just one last verse I've got written down here in Romans chapter 10, verse 17. And again, there's a lot each side of it. We're just grabbing the statement, and that verse says, so then faith cometh by hearing, but not just hearing anything, and hearing by the word of God. So the more we mix it with the Bible, the more we mix with brethren who talk faith, the more we go to meetings and hear talks of faith, the more it builds up our faith. Surround ourselves totally saturate ourselves in the world of faith. There is great reward. And all the people said, amen.